The hidden truth about Priscilla. The story that started with a 14-year-old girl. 1959, Germany. 24-year-old Elvis Presley was serving the final months of his military duty when, one night at a party, he met a 14-year-old girl. The relationship that began that night would become one of the most controversial chapters of Elvis's life. Priscilla Beaulieu was still a child, while Elvis was one of the most famous men in the world. So how could an adult man start a relationship with such a young girl? And more importantly, how was this relationship kept hidden for years, accepted by society? Why did her family allow it? Throughout this video, we'll explore the dark truths of Elvis and Priscilla's relationship, society's attitudes at the time, and how this story is perceived today. Because this isn't just a love story, it's also a story about power imbalance, age difference, and a girl lost in the shadow of fame. Before we dive deeper into this complex and troubling story, I want to ask you something. If you're interested in the untold, controversial, and real stories behind the legends, then you're in the right place. This channel brings you stories about Elvis that you won't find anywhere else, with details that challenge what you thought you knew. Hit that subscribe button now, because what you're about to hear will forever change how you see the king of rock and roll. A meeting in Germany, September 1959. In September 1959, in the area where American military units were stationed near Bad Nauheim, Germany, small parties were organized every week. These were moments of consolation away from home for soldiers, escapes from boring military life. At that time, Elvis Presley was an ordinary soldier serving in the United States Army. Yes, he was the world's most famous rock star, but there in his uniform, he was doing the same duty as other soldiers. After his mother Gladys died in 1958, Elvis was going through a very difficult period. He was lonely, sad, and his military service in Germany was both an escape and a prison for him. One evening, a party was organized at a house near where Elvis was staying. The host was one of Elvis's friends and had invited Elvis too. That night, Elvis went to the party with a few friends. Inside, music was playing, people were dancing and talking. Elvis sat in the corner, drink in hand, watching the people around him. Then the door opened and a young girl entered. She caught attention with her dark brown hair, big blue eyes, and childlike features. An adult was with her, her stepfather who served in the Air Force. Elvis looked at the girl and felt his interest piqued. The girl was innocent, shy, and seemed a bit lost among the adults around her. Elvis's friend introduced the girl to Elvis. Her name was Priscilla Beaulieu, and she was only 14 years old. Elvis was 24 years old, exactly 10 years difference between them. But that night, this age difference didn't matter to anyone. Elvis began talking with Priscilla. He asked her questions about music, talked about America, and told stories from his own life. Priscilla listened to Elvis's words as if mesmerized. After all, sitting across from her was one of the most famous people in the world, talking to her personally. For a child, this was like a dream. At the end of that night, Elvis told Priscilla he wanted to see her again. How did Priscilla's stepfather, Air Force Captain Paul Beaulieu, react to this situation? Surprisingly, he didn't object. Someone like Elvis Presley showing interest in his 14-year-old daughter was seen not as dangerous, but as an honor at that time. Elvis's fame had taken precedence over moral concerns. Captain Beaulieu and his wife Anne allowed their daughter to spend time with such a famous person, instead of questioning Elvis's intentions. This decision would be much debated years later. But at the time, nobody saw a problem. So what happened after this first meeting? How did Elvis and Priscilla's relationship develop? And was Priscilla's family really not uncomfortable with this situation? The developing relationship and the family's role. In the weeks after their first meeting, Elvis and Priscilla began seeing each other frequently. Elvis would invite Priscilla to his house, play her recordings, and they would talk for hours. For Priscilla, this experience was enchanting. For a 14-year-old girl, spending private time with the world's most famous person was an incredible feeling. But the dynamics of this relationship were very unbalanced. Elvis was an adult, a superstar with world experience, worshipped by millions. Priscilla was still a child, a high school student who spent most of her life in classroom desks. Elvis's interest in Priscilla wasn't just friendship. According to what Priscilla wrote in her own memoirs years later, Elvis had told her he found her physically attractive. But at the same time, he had stated that he also loved Priscilla's innocence, her childlike demeanor. Elvis began shaping Priscilla to his liking. He told her how she should dress, how she should do her hair, even how she should behave. Priscilla complied with Elvis's wishes because she wanted to please him, and her admiration for him was above everything else. How did Priscilla's family view this relationship? Captain Beaulieu was impressed by Elvis being famous, but also worried. After all, his daughter was still a child, and Elvis was a 24-year-old man. But Elvis made a promise to the Beaulieu family. He guaranteed he would be respectful to Priscilla, care about her education, and protect her. These words convinced the Beaulieu family. Elvis's fame and charisma had a huge impact on the family. Perhaps they thought being with someone like Elvis would be good for their daughter. Perhaps they hoped this relationship was temporary, and after Elvis's military service ended, he would return to America and everything would be forgotten. But Elvis's plans were different. In March 1960, his military service ended and it was time to return to America. Before leaving Germany, Elvis said goodbye to Priscilla. But this goodbye wasn't permanent. Elvis continued writing letters to Priscilla, called her, and stayed in contact. Priscilla couldn't forget Elvis. For a 14-year-old girl, someone like Elvis's interest in her was the most important event of her life. She went to school, spent time with friends, but her mind was always on Elvis. Elvis didn't break contact with Priscilla after returning to America. But what happened to Priscilla's life? And did Elvis really not forget her? Or did he have another plan? The invitation to Graceland. A controversial decision. By 1962, Priscilla had turned 17. She had been communicating with Elvis by letter and phone for 3 years. Elvis hadn't forgotten Priscilla. On the contrary, he wanted to invite her to Graceland, his mansion in Memphis. But Priscilla wasn't yet of legal age, and for her family to allow her to go to America and stay at Elvis's house was a very controversial decision. So how did the Beaulieu family allow this? Elvis presented a very convincing proposal. He said Priscilla would enroll in a Catholic school in Memphis, stay with a family, and Elvis would only see her as a visitor. The Beaulieu family trusted these guarantees and decided to send 17-year-old Priscilla to Elvis's city. This decision, viewed by today's standards, is surprising and concerning. But in the 1960s, especially when a celebrity like Elvis was involved, society evaluated such situations differently. When Priscilla arrived in Memphis, she encountered a reality very different from the stated arrangements. Yes, she had enrolled in Catholic school, but she spent most of her time at Graceland with Elvis. Elvis had completely integrated Priscilla into his own life. He taught her how to dress, how to do makeup, how to speak. Priscilla tried to be what Elvis wanted because pleasing him, earning his approval, was her greatest desire. But in this process, Priscilla's own identity, her own wishes were gradually disappearing. She was now just a young girl trying to be what Elvis wanted. Life at Graceland was both enchanting and overwhelming for Priscilla. On one hand, she was living with a legend like Elvis, had a life of luxury. On the other hand, she constantly had to comply with Elvis's rules. Elvis controlled who Priscilla spent time with, where she went, even when she slept. Was this love or control? At the time, Priscilla tried to interpret this as love. She saw Elvis's attention and interest in her as proof of how much he loved her. But in reality, this was a power imbalance. Elvis was 10 years older than Priscilla, world famous, and in a position to control every aspect of Priscilla's life. What did Priscilla feel while living at Graceland? Was being under Elvis's control really happiness for her? And was Priscilla's family aware of their daughter's situation? Marriage and public eye. By 1967, Priscilla had turned 22 and had been with Elvis for 8 years. But they still weren't married. Elvis was very hesitant about marriage. On one hand, he loved Priscilla and wanted to be with her. On the other hand, he was afraid of losing his freedom, being tied to one woman. But pressures were mounting. Priscilla's family wanted Elvis to marry their daughter. Hollywood producers said Elvis needed to marry to keep his image clean. And the public wondered why Elvis still hadn't married Priscilla, with whom he'd been together for so long. Finally, Elvis decided to marry. One May morning in Las Vegas, in a very small ceremony, Elvis and Priscilla got married. The wedding had been hastily organized, and only a few close friends and family members attended. The media received this news with great excitement. The world's most famous bachelor had finally married. But the truth behind the wedding wasn't that romantic. Elvis had seen marriage as a necessity. Priscilla thought the moment she'd been waiting for years had finally come true. In the first year of their marriage, Priscilla became pregnant, and in February 1968, their daughter Lisa Marie was born. Elvis was happy to become a father, but at the same time, this new responsibility scared him. Priscilla was now not just a wife, but also a mother. Life at Graceland changed with Lisa Marie's birth. But Elvis and Priscilla's relationship was becoming increasingly difficult. Elvis was focused on his career, constantly on tour, and Priscilla was often left alone at Graceland. In the later years of their marriage, the bond between Elvis and Priscilla weakened. Elvis was having relationships with other women, and Priscilla was aware of this situation. But she stayed silent because she didn't want to lose Elvis. For years, her life had revolved around Elvis, and she didn't know what she would do without him. But at some point, Priscilla realized she could no longer bear it. She realized she had lost herself, wasn't living her own life. And in 1972, she decided to leave Elvis. How was Priscilla's decision to leave received? How did Elvis accept the situation? And after living in Elvis's shadow for years, how did Priscilla build her own life? Divorce and after. In October 1973, Elvis and Priscilla's divorce was finalized. Priscilla got custody of Lisa Marie and left Graceland. The divorce process caused a big stir in public. Everyone wondered why the king of rock and roll's marriage had ended. Some blamed Elvis, some blamed Priscilla. But the truth was, both sides were unhappy for different reasons. Elvis wanted his freedom back. Priscilla wanted to find her own identity. After the divorce, Priscilla tried to rebuild her life. She had lived in Elvis's shadow for years and now wanted to stand on her own feet. First, she turned to an acting career, took roles in television series. Then she entered the business world and began managing Elvis's legacy. The idea to turn Graceland into a museum was Priscilla's, and this decision immortalized Elvis's legacy. Priscilla began to be known not just as Elvis's ex-wife, but as a successful businesswoman. Elvis lived 4 more years after the divorce. These 4 years were the most difficult period of his life. His health was poor, drug use was out of control, and his stage performances weren't as energetic as before. In August 1977, Elvis lost his life at 42. When Priscilla received news of Elvis's death, she was very upset. Their marriage had ended, but Elvis was a big part of her life. He was Lisa Marie's father, her first love, and the person she had given years to. After Elvis's death, Priscilla continued raising her daughter, Lisa Marie, alone. Lisa Marie was only 9 years old when she lost her father, and Priscilla tried to be both mother and father to her. As years passed, Priscilla began talking more about Elvis. She wrote her memoirs, gave interviews, and revealed the true nature of her relationship with Elvis. These confessions shocked Elvis fans because Priscilla said their relationship wasn't always happy, that Elvis controlled her, and that she had lost her own identity for years. So how did Priscilla's confessions affect Elvis's image? And how is Elvis and Priscilla's relationship evaluated today? Today's perspective: re-evaluating the relationship. Today, when we look at Elvis and Priscilla's relationship, that meeting in 1959 looks very different. A 24-year-old man starting a relationship with a 14-year-old girl is an unacceptable situation today. The concepts of pedophilia, grooming, and child abuse are now much better understood, and society doesn't tolerate such situations. But in 1959, especially when a superstar like Elvis was involved, such relationships were overlooked. What Priscilla wrote in her own memoirs shows how problematic this relationship was. Priscilla confessed that she never felt equal in her relationship with Elvis, constantly tried to gain Elvis's approval, and lost her own wishes, her own identity. Elvis tried to shape Priscilla according to his own ideal, and Priscilla submitted because she thought she had no other choice. Elvis's fans have difficulty accepting these claims. For them, Elvis is the king of rock and roll, a legend, and they don't want this legend to be overshadowed. But the truth is, Elvis was also human and could make mistakes. Starting a relationship with a 14-year-old girl was a big mistake. And the consequences of this mistake deeply affected Priscilla's life. Today, many feminists and child rights advocates criticize Elvis and Priscilla's relationship. They say this relationship was an example of power imbalance, that Priscilla's childhood was stolen, and Elvis's behavior was unacceptable. These criticisms have begun questioning Elvis's legacy. Now, not just his music is looked at, but his private life too, and some of his behaviors are being evaluated by today's standards. So how does this re-evaluation affect Elvis's legacy? Do his fans still defend him? And what does Priscilla think about this relationship today? Priscilla's perspective: liberation and empowerment. When Priscilla Presley published her memoir, Elvis and Me, in 1985, she shared the true nature of her relationship with Elvis with the public for the first time. In the book, she told how Elvis controlled her, tried to shape her, and how unbalanced their relationship was. But at the same time, she stated she still loved Elvis, and he was an important part of her life. This book created huge debates among Elvis fans. Some accused Priscilla of disrespecting Elvis's memory. Others appreciated her courage. As years passed, Priscilla began speaking even more openly. In interviews, she emphasized how problematic it was for a 14-year-old girl to have a relationship with a 24-year-old man. She said, as her own daughter Lisa Marie grew up, she understood how vulnerable a 14-year-old child was. She stated if her daughter Lisa Marie had wanted to have a relationship with a 24-year-old man when she was 14, she definitely wouldn't have allowed it. These confessions showed Priscilla had begun evaluating her own experiences with a critical eye. Priscilla's story isn't limited to just her relationship with Elvis. She became a strong woman who, after living in Elvis's shadow for years, managed to find her own identity. She succeeded in business, turned Graceland into a tourism empire, and protected Elvis's legacy. But most importantly, she found her own voice. She was no longer just Elvis's ex-wife. Priscilla Presley was a name recognized in her own right. Priscilla's transformation inspired many women. Her story was the story of a woman who entered an unbalanced relationship at a young age, lost her identity, but eventually found herself. And this story finds much more voice today because society better understands concepts of power, imbalance, control, and abuse. So how does Elvis's family, especially his daughter Lisa Marie, approach these debates? And how is Elvis's legacy affected by these criticisms? Lisa Marie and the legacy debate. Lisa Marie Presley always evaluated her father's and mother's relationship in a complex way. On one hand, she loved her father very much and wanted to protect his musical legacy. On the other hand, she also understood what her mother went through and acknowledged how problematic that relationship that started at 14 was. Lisa Marie said her father wasn't perfect, made mistakes. And the biggest of these was her mother entering his life at such a young age. Lisa Marie's own life also passed in the shadow of her father's fame. She lost her father at 9 and afterward was known as Elvis's daughter. This identity was both a blessing and a curse for her. On one hand, her father's legacy offered her many opportunities. On the other hand, constantly being referred to as Elvis's daughter made finding her own identity difficult. Lisa Marie started her own music career when she became an adult, but was always compared to her father. Elvis's legacy is a controversial topic today. On one hand, his music is one of the most important pieces of rock and roll history. Songs like Hound Dog, Jailhouse Rock, Can't Help Falling in Love are listened to for generations, and Elvis is remembered as one of music history's legends. On the other hand, his private life, especially his relationship with Priscilla, is evaluated with a critical eye. This situation creates a dilemma. Should we ignore his problematic behaviors while celebrating Elvis's musical legacy? Or should we evaluate both separately? These questions apply not just to Elvis, but to many celebrities. Throughout history, there have been many artists whose art was magnificent, but who displayed problematic behaviors in their private lives. How should we evaluate these artists' works? Some say we need to separate art from the artist. Elvis's music can be great, but this doesn't excuse his problematic behaviors. Others argue we can't separate an artist's private life from their works because art comes from within the person and has an inseparable connection with who the person is. This debate continues today, and there's no definitive answer. So ultimately, what does Elvis and Priscilla's story teach us? What lessons does this relationship leave for today? Conclusion. The lessons this relationship leaves for today. The story of Elvis Presley and Priscilla Beaulieu isn't a simple love story. This is a story about power imbalance, age difference, the effect of fame, and how a girl's childhood was stolen. The relationship that began in 1959 was accepted within the social norms of that time. But today, the same relationship is definitely evaluated as unacceptable. Priscilla's story is the story of many young women. A young woman who catches the attention of a famous, powerful, charismatic man is made to feel special by him, but ultimately loses her own identity. For years, Priscilla tried to be what Elvis wanted. She changed for him, suppressed her own wishes, and focused on pleasing Elvis. But eventually, she realized this made her unhappy and decided to change. The most important lesson of this story is how dangerous age and power imbalance can be in relationships. A 14-year-old child cannot establish an equal relationship with a 24-year-old adult. Because the difference in experience, maturity, and power is too great. Elvis, with his fame, age, and experience, had tremendous influence over Priscilla, and Priscilla wasn't mature enough to resist this influence. The second lesson is how fame can act as a shield. Elvis, being famous, prevented society from questioning his behavior. Even Priscilla's family allowed their daughter to spend time with such a famous person, instead of questioning Elvis's intentions. Fame can blind moral judgments and cause unacceptable behaviors to be overlooked. The third lesson is how easy it can be to lose your identity. Priscilla changed herself to please Elvis, but this change didn't make her happy. On the contrary, it made her forget who she was, and years later, she had to find herself again. This is the story not just of Priscilla, but of many people in similar relationships. Elvis and Priscilla's story also shows how social norms change over time. A relationship considered acceptable in 1959 is definitely unacceptable today. This is a result of society's progress, better understanding of children's rights, and being more conscious against power imbalances. And this change is a positive change. Priscilla Presley, approaching 80 today, looks at her life and evaluates her years with Elvis as both valuable and difficult. Elvis was her first love, her daughter's father, and a big part of her life. But at the same time, that relationship taught Priscilla many things: valuing herself, finding her own voice, and the importance of not surrendering her identity to someone else. Elvis Presley's music is immortal and will continue to be listened to for generations. But his private life, especially his relationship with Priscilla, should be evaluated with a critical eye. This doesn't mean completely rejecting Elvis's legacy, but it means acknowledging he wasn't perfect, made mistakes, and we need to learn from these mistakes. In conclusion, Elvis and Priscilla's story isn't just a story belonging to the past. This is a story addressing issues still relevant today: power imbalance, age difference, control, identity loss, and recovery. And perhaps most importantly, this story teaches us this: fame and charisma cannot justify problematic behaviors. In every relationship, there should be respect, equality, and freedom. And if these aren't present, that relationship isn't a real relationship. It's a control mechanism.